One day, Edward was in the shed where he lived with the other engines. They were all bigger than Edward and boasted about it. Said Gordon. But the driver and fireman felt sorry for Edward. Said Edward. So they lit his fire, made lots of steam, and Edward puffed away. The other engines were very cross of being left behind. Edward worked hard all day. The coaches thought he was very kind, and the driver was very pleased. Edward told the other engines that night. But he didn't hear what they thought, for he was so tired and happy that he fell asleep at once. Next morning, Edward woke up to find nothing had changed. Gordon was still boasting. Edward went off to do some shunting. He liked shunting. It was fun playing with freight cars. He would come out quietly and give them a push. Then he would stop and the silly freight cars would go bump into each other. They cried. Edward played till there were no more freight cars. Then he stopped to rest. Presently he heard a whistle. Gordon was very cross. Instead of nice new coaches, he was pulling a dirty freight train. He grumbled. Edward laughed and went to find some more freight cars. Then there was trouble. The porter called to Edward's driver. They found Gordon halfway up and very cross. His driver and fireman would talk to him severely. Said Gordon. Edward's driver came up. Said Gordon. Replied Edward's driver. They brought the train back to the bottom of the hill. Said Edward. Grumbled Gordon. They pulled and pushed as hard as they could. Puffed Gordon. Puffed Gordon. Puffed Edward. Edward pushed and puffed and pushed as hard as ever he could, and almost before he realized it, Gordon found himself at the top of the hill. He said proudly, he forgot all about kind Edward and didn't say thank you. Edward just left out of breath and far behind, but he was happy because he had been so helpful. At the next station, he found that the driver and fireman were very pleased with him. The fireman gave him a nice long drink, and the driver said,